This video will show you as a landlord rep how you can go about using AscendixRE to track the activity whereby you are pursuing the landlord for a particular listing and what that process is like once you win the listing and then want to start to track the vacant spaces within that building and work on the marketing activities that you would be performing on behalf of that listing, in addition to gathering inquiries about that listing or space, and then ultimately managing deal flow pipeline for prospective tenants within that space that will ultimately amount in a lease or a lease abstract. And so knowing that, when you subscribe to a CRM, the most basic functions or objects used are accounts and contacts. And this term here, it is a very general way to categorize accounts. Accounts can be clients, prospects, tenants, other brokerage firms, landlords, etc. And the way that you would discern who they are is by subscribing a type to them. So I will search for a particular, let's just say, landlord I want to pursue. We search for it, and within the details tab of the company or account record, you could see you could just gather some high-level information, website, etc. I've tagged them as a prospect. In your Ascendix, whether you're a trial or an existing customer, know that you could always customize this list to speak your verbiage. So maybe you want to be more detailed and say landlord, prospect, or something to that effect. Know that you can do that. And the reason why you would do that initially is this is a good way to segment your accounts or your company so that you're not commingling necessarily clients with tenants, etc. And so you can, by tagging this company as a type prospect, find that when you go back to the original accounts view, there will be a pre-created list or filtered list that I have in my demo called prospects. And so that's just something to be aware of. In this case, regarding Truax development, again, if you've got their phone number and whatnot, you could be logging activities. These activities would effectively be you calling on them or meeting with them or sending them emails. Really, again, the goal here is to track the correspondence up until you win the listing. Now, if you really wanted to be very detail oriented, you could hop all the way over to deals, whereby you'll notice a lot of deal types, but one of them is listing pursuit. And this is if you wanted to be very detailed in the data you're collecting to be able to track the kind of listing you're pursuing, the kind of stage that it's in, link the specific property for that seller or prospective seller, which is your client, right? And you would link Truax development to that, and then continue on. When this deal closes, because it's just a listing pursuit, it will automatically create a listing record for you. Listing record is the agreement that you have, and it highlights all the details of that agreement. But if you didn't want to do that, and this is optional, and wanted to track your activity directly on the owner landlord's account record, or if specifically here on the right, you could see that there are 3 people that work there, and it was Gabrielle specifically that you're working with, any activities you add to her record will roll up to her company record as well. And so, again, a very subjective decision where you decide to log that pursuing activity, so to speak. At one point, if that particular landlord has a property, you probably will want to add it in here. To create a property record, you need to know the type of property that it is and apply a name to it. That name could be a street address. For the most part, it usually is. You don't really have to populate all fields on here. However, an address is recommended, and of course, connecting who that landlord is. Again, Truax, and maybe Gabrielle is the contact, and so on. So having the property in here gives you good context so that you know when you're pursuing a listing which property it's for. The end game, however, is once you've got that, and so I'm just going to go into one of an existing property so I don't recreate the wheel here. This is a property for Temecula Marketplace that is owned by Truax Development with my owner landlord contact is Michelle. And in theory, if I've won a listing for this property, I can go to the right side here of the property record and notice that there are many other records I could create in connection with this particular property. In this case, it will be listing, because that's what I'm really trying to capture, that it's a lease listing. And I can just call it 2020 lease listing. It's already connected to the property. You could indicate when that expires so that you have that in your view when you're trying to make sure everything's organized, and then connect again, Truax or essentially who you are, which is the listing broker company and the contact, your brokerage and your name, your contact record. And that's really, that listing record is there to do a few things. Again, because it's the agreement, it allows you to really connect everything to that listing, because that's what you have an obligation for. So I'm just going to go ahead and save it so we can take a look at what happens. Number one, you'll notice that back at the property record, listings now shows a counter of 1, meaning that we've got 1 listing in here. Just hover over to that listing record. A few things here, aside from the data that I entered on the form itself, what you saw prior, you'll notice in the activity timeline, there's just some activities that were automatically created. This is a workflow Ascendix has set up. You could always remove it or overwrite it with your own verbiage. We just assumed that when a broker wins a listing, there are some prescriptive steps they take to get that listing marketed. And some of that involves setting up a template to e-blast brokers, creating a listing event, setting up a report that you could run on a frequency of weekly or monthly or whatnot for the landlord to show activity. So these are staggered. If today is February 21st, you see that they're staggered a few days out. If you've completed them, you could just check off your tasks, and this will show when you run a report for the listing that you've done these outbound activities, which is effectively what they are. And most of these tend to be outbound. Before we talk about inbound interest in that particular listing, you'll probably, as a landlord rep, want to add the information about the individual suites or units that are for lease, because they'll have different characteristics such as space and rent ranges, right? So that's what availability is. So again, to circle back, we are on the listing record that is connected to the property. Many times we get the question of what is the difference between the property and the listing? The reality is the property is the physical asset, the building itself and its physical characteristics. The listing is the agreement. And over the course of the property, there could be multiple listings for it, different listing brokers handling it, etc. Or even within the same building, there might be different brokers at the same time handling different floors and whatnot. So that being said, although you have to have a property to have a listing record, they're not one and the same. It's almost like the property is the parent and the listing is the child. So the listing record is the agreement that you have an obligation for. It is connected to the property, but on the right side, we see that you could also add availabilities, which again is the vacant space or maybe soon to be vacant space for that given unit. So you would name the unit, assign a type to it, indicate a floor if you wanted to, indicate if it's available or not, put in a square footage, and then the rent information if you wish. So this is basically an inventory of the property that you have. Now, if you have a rent roll and you want to add the tenants in that building, you could jump over to the leases tab and do that, or contextually go back to Temecula Marketplace, which is your given property, and then from there notice that you could also add the leases, which would really be the tenants. In this case, it's not really listing related, it's just the tenants that were there possibly prior to when you won the listing, and then you could populate who that tenant is, which again would be a company and the square footage they occupy. So just something to be mindful of. It does imply a great deal of data entry. For the most part, if you've got that information already on a spreadsheet, it can be imported in. Assuming you've already got your property in place, you've won the agreement, you've added the vacant units or availabilities, notice that if I click on the availabilities tab, it will show me all of the vacant units regardless of the property. So each of these tabs on their own have their own data regardless of the property. But when you're looking at it from a property or listing perspective, it's going to be centric or specific to that listing. So when I see these availabilities, it's showing 0 because I've not added any. I certainly could. And since it's a retail building, we'll just say it's a retail type and it's got 5,000 square feet available. You could provide a description if you want, or the type of lease that's recommended. We'll just put a high-low there and just save it. As much information as you need that would be helpful to you. Now at this rate, if your advertising or your marketing is working well, you might want to then log those who are inquiring about that space or that listing in general. Those inquiries may come over the phone or over email and whatnot. So You've got, again, here, inquiries, which we're back on the listing record still. You can add an inquiry. You could also add an inquiry from up here. The only difference is you'll need to go back later and link it to the particular listing they're calling about. So the benefit of adding it directly from the record is that it will auto-populate it for you. So we'll just say new inquiry. Now, if the person that is calling or emailing is the prospective tenant's broker, you could certainly link the broker info. If it's the prospective tenant directly themselves, you could capture their name, their company, their email, their phone number. They're basically their contact info. Find out where it is they heard from you, select it, maybe it was an e-blast. If they're calling about a specific suite, you could certainly always do that. Let's just go ahead and populate that. Okay. And you know, complete what's the only thing that's required is the inquiry name here. So you could just say, juice bar inquiry as an example, and populate what you see fit. The goal here is you're really capturing unqualified interest in the space. You probably have a prescriptive process in what that's like, whether it's touring or understanding the space needs or the urgency of that tenant to move in. And so if it was the prospective tenant directly, you could just enter whatever you know about them, and phone and email, etc. And if they happen to tell you what space or rent range they're looking for, that's great. Or when they require to move in, that's great as well. You can always click that and you would save it. And so sort of stopping here, where your reporting would be materially significant for your landlord will be two places. Your outbound activities, any appointments, emails, calls you've made. Outbound would be reportable, which is this timeline that you see here. When you report on it, it would come out in Excel and it would look a bit more traditional in what you're used to seeing in a report. And the inquiries. And so the inquiries could be, if you've got 10 this week or 20 over the course of the month, the reports feature within Ascendix will be able to pull that for you. And as long as you're adding the records, the report will effectively materialize that information fairly quickly. Back to the inquiry here, the goal of an inquiry is to, as soon as possible, either convert it or disqualify it. That being, are they a good fit for the space to become a prospective tenant in Suite 200, or are they not a good fit for it because for whatever reason it didn't work out? So when you click on convert, it effectively allows you to create 3 records with one click. You could create a company or account record for organic juices, a contact record for Joe Smith, and even a deal record, whereby now we're going to work on the financials of that prospective tenant in that space, such as what the lease terms are and whatnot. So some people, if you're ready to convert it, but just to the company and the contact and not yet a deal, you could also say don't convert to deal because you're not ready. At one point later on, if they move forward, you'll need to then manually create the deal. But if we said, okay, go ahead, create all of those things, and I click on convert, 3 new records will have been created. Those records are from the inquiry being converted, an account record for organic juices, a contact record for Joe Smith, a deal record for Juice Bar Inquiry, and you could disregard this as it does not really make any relevance to this conversation here. I'm going to go ahead and skip right to the Juice Bar Inquiry deal. What's nice here is it's almost trickling or populating a lot of the information you've already entered. Number one, it knows that this is a landlord rep deal. It's connected to the listing, connected to the property, connected the owner, landlord, and contact, connected where that business came from, and connected the tenant. So really the only thing you're doing on this deal is working on the lower part, which is the financials. Financials of what that prospective rate will be, commencement, expiration, etc., as that will eventually provide you with that pipeline and what that looks like, including a commission percentage that your organization would be getting from that total lease value. That's what deal value is. It's the rent table across the entire periods of time that they'll be leasing that space. And so it could be, if it's $2 million and your organization's getting 3%, then when you save that or update it, those numbers will auto-calculate so that that overall commission is $60,000. If you happen to be subscribing to our enterprise version, which includes commission calculations, it takes this commission beyond this overall $60,000 and allows you to add broker splits with house and whatnot, but if you're subscribed just to foundations, then you're able to at least just get a general sense of what that looks like. So that's the deal. Before I move on to the process of the deal, I'll click on the deals tab in and of itself. There are different ways you could view your deals, which is again your active pipeline, especially with some financial obligation tied to it. And so if you are wanting to segment just your landlord rep deals, maybe that's all you do, or it's just where you primarily work, you could do that. You can also view the data beyond in a list view like this, in a view, if you click over here, called Kanban, which basically allows you to view the data in a bit more of a visual fashion. And so by doing that, you can see the deals grouped by stage and the total dollar values subscribed to that stage. So if I were to look at here and say, where is the most, it looks like there's 20 million in underwriting. And also, if you wanted to move something from, let's say, none over to a different stage, moving it actually changes the stage of that deal. Speaking of deals and stages, so if we go back to our juice bar deal here, the stage part is a significant part of how most people manage their deals, because there's a maturity level or a progress that you'll want to be able to track. So another thing that you're reporting to your landlords is not just outbound activities and inbound inquiries, but also deals in the pipeline, where we are with each one, etc. And so managing the stage will be an integral part of that. At one point, however, this deal will hopefully close, mature up until a point where all is said and done in the real world, and there'll be an option for you to close that deal. Now, the goal here is that, similar to how when we converted the inquiry, all the information moved to the deal, when you close this deal, all of the information will move to the lease, which is the lease abstract, so that there's very little duplicative data entry, allowing you to just move that from one process to another. Since the deal is closed, it's no longer an active deal. It's basically a done deal, so to speak, which is really what the lease is. Now, again, if you're subscribed to the enterprise version and you just want to close deal and you clicked on it, you might get an error that says you've not added a commission. So a little segue here for those who are subscribed to the enterprise that has commissions, you will need to add a related commission to that deal. And in doing so, really what you're stating is there's an inside broker, they've got a split with house. House is getting 40, the broker is getting 60, and so of that 60,000, 36,000 belongs to house, and the balance of that belongs to, 24,000 belongs to the company and 36,000 belongs to the broker. So just keep that in mind. There'll probably be a separate video on how to add commissions, since it does require some steps, but just keep that in mind. That being said, you would go to deal close, put in the actual close date. Notice that create lease record automatically populated. If for whatever unfortunate reason the deal is lost, you could mark it as lost, and then it would not create a lease comp record. And of course, populate whatever you know, assuming that you would have populated that on the deal. So I'll just go ahead and save. And now you'll notice the view has changed to the Leases tab, which now shows the unit, the originating deal, so that you've got a breadcrumb trail, the property, obviously, the space, tenant and owner, and some of the financials around that. And again, the better the deal record would have been populated, the more that this lease record would be populated. If, for example, on the deal, let's say you forgot to add the fact that there is going to be bumps throughout this 5-year duration of this lease, there's an option to add escalations, whether it's percentage or amount, and then if it was 2%, you could put that, or if it was a flat amount, you could put that, and if there's any free rent or allowances, you could update that record as well. Notice on the lease as well, on the left, though, you've got the fields. On the right, you've got the lease periods table, which is now really reflecting the 6 periods with the 2% bumps that we've added, and then the total rent to be collected. Many times that 2% doesn't always apply from the first period to the last, in which case it would require that you manually go into each lease period and update the numbers as you see fit. So if the 2% bump didn't commence until period 3 and the first 2 periods were the same, then I would need to go into the second one and apply it as $28 if it hasn't changed, and then proceed to edit the subsequent records to reflect what that 2% looks like. So some math would be required of you to update that, in that now you're really getting 2% of $28, and that would not be $29.13 since that was based on the value prior. So just keep that in mind, but knowing that you could do that certainly gives you, because this is automated based on the inputs that you put on the left, and those inputs are when a lease commences, when it expires, the square footage, and if there are bumps, you put them. If there are no bumps, then the rent would be flat throughout the entire time. Anytime you make a change to the financials, you'll want to click this button called Regenerate Lease Periods, since that will allow you to update the lease period grid. And finally, as far as reports are concerned, though this video won't cover how to create a report, know that Ascendix as a general has the ability to provide you with custom reports. We've created some templates, so if it's a report for listings and activities, you'll notice that there's an activity report, inquiry report, listings with deals and whatnot. And so if you've got the data to supply that, then you'll notice that just by clicking on it, it will basically feed this report with that data. Now, this is not specifically stating for which listing. In your case, you may want to apply filters to say only show it for this listing instead of all of your listings, but just know that those are just some areas you can fine tune as you continue to use Ascendix. So that covers it. In one fell swoop, you've gone from prospecting the landlord at an account or company level to eventually adding their property, winning the listing, logging the vacancies or availabilities within that building, maybe adding a rent roll if you wish, being able to log the inquiries against that listing that you've received, converting them into deals, and eventually closing the deal as it becomes a lease. Going to the Leases tab real quick, you'll notice that you could also create custom views to show you what's expiring in the next 18 months. You can also have reminders based on this expiration date so that you get alerted when leases are expiring.